Thank you. Now for today's session. Our two speakers today are Doreen Stabinsky and Tamara Gilbertson. Dr. Doreen Stabinsky is a member of the Faculty of Global Environmental Politics at the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine. Dr. Stabinsky researches and writes about the impacts of climate change on agriculture and food security, and on the emerging issues of loss and damage from slow onset impacts of climate change. She also serves as an advisor to a number of governments and international NGOs on issues related to agriculture and the ongoing negotiations under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Dr. Tamara Gilbertson is the Carbon Pricing Education Coordinator and Climate Change Policy Advisor of the Indigenous Environmental Network. She has a PhD from the University of Tennessee, Department of Sociology. She mainly works on environmental and climate justice, social movements, and extractive industry research, as well as carbon pricing, forest, and land policies related to development policies. Tamara is also a lecturer at the University of Tennessee. So I believe Doreen is going to go first. So Doreen, if you want to share your screen, and the floor is yours.
All right, let's see what I can do about sharing the screen successfully and starting. Everything set?
Looks good.
Fabulous. And I'm going to start my little timer so I don't take up too much time. So greetings, everyone. Really nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of the NFUniversity. I'm going to deliver a bit more of the science side of the talk today. I'm going to present some ways to think about carbon offsets and carbon trading by first introducing some ways of how we might think about carbon and climate change. Please jot down questions as you go. Usually in the classroom, I'm happy to have a back and forth. And I think with this sort of setup, we can't do that, sadly, but I'm looking forward to your questions afterwards. So make it go forward, yeah. So carbon, starting off with carbon. We are all made of carbon. Carbon is the building block of life. Probably most of you are well aware of this. Pretty much everything alive at one time or another is made of carbon. I think everything. The chemistry of living systems, called organic chemistry, is really the chemistry of molecules that contain carbon. Sounds like there's somebody with their microphone on. Yeah, thanks. But dead stuff too, right? So fossil fuels are made of organisms that died eons ago, and fossil fuels are another more chemistry kind of way to talk about fossil fuels is hydrocarbons, long chains of carbon with hydrogen attached. And those bonds between those carbon molecules, when they break apart, they release energy. And so that's what we do when we burn fossil fuels. We break apart those carbon bonds, and then those carbon molecules bind with oxygen, and we get carbon dioxide. So that might be a review, but I wanted to set up a common starting point for all of us with respect to carbon. And today I want to talk about, let me leave that for a second. Today I want to talk about two different sources of carbon, right? Carbon that's fossil carbon, that's coming from fossil fuels, and what I'll call terrestrial carbon, the carbon that's in our ecosystems. It's alive and it's dead, but it's not dead for millions of years, the way that fossil fuel carbon has been dead and condensed over millions of years. And I want to start introducing this idea of a fast cycle and a slow cycle. And I want to talk about active pools of carbon, so cycles and pools. Terrestrial carbon is part of what we call the fast carbon cycle. And in that fast carbon cycle, we have three pools. We have terrestrial, the land pool, the atmospheric pool, and the ocean pool. And so here's a glimpse of those pools and the fast carbon cycle. A tree grows, it dies, it decomposes. The carbon might stay in the soil for a while. The carbon might get oxidized and turn into carbon dioxide and then spend some time in the atmosphere. It might get breathed in or taken up by seaweed that then dies and decomposes and spends some time in the ocean.
Doreen,
Yeah,
don't mean to interrupt, but are you advancing? Are you on the slide you want to be, or are they advancing?
I am on the slide I want to be on.
Just check.
I will show some pictures of what I'm talking about in a second.
Sorry for the interruption.
Thanks. No, that's okay. Thanks so much. Thanks so much. That happens definitely. So, so my molecule of carbon, seaweed into the ocean, stays a while in the ocean before it's oxidized and ends up in the atmosphere again. You get the picture. There's an active cycle. And that cycle, I mean, carbon can reside in any of those pools for tens to hundreds of years, but it's more or less in a dynamic balance. And it's more or less around, tens to hundreds of years of sitting in that cycle. The residence time of carbon in the terrestrial biosphere or between the terrestrial biosphere and the atmosphere is something around 5 to 10 years. Oceans carbon stays a couple of 100 years. When we start talking about the slow carbon cycle, which is rocks and then fossil fuels, we're talking about 100,000, 200,000 years for the rock cycle, and then millions of years for fossil fuels. So here's where I start showing my nice pictures. Here's a picture of the slow fossil cycle, where to get that hydrocarbon in the rock takes millions of years. It goes up like that when it moves into the atmosphere. But I wanted to more point out the fact that fossil carbon in this picture is in the slow cycle versus a quick terrestrial cycle where you have carbon in the soil or in organisms up into the atmosphere, back down again. And then this graphic, I mean, there's a few things to point out in the graphic, and you'll have the slide deck to take home and spend some more time with the graphic if you'd like. One is the little box in the left-hand side, which gives you a comparison of the residence times of carbon in each of those, reservoirs or pools. You can see here, not so much the hydrocarbon cycle, but you can see the very slow cycle of a couple of 100,000 of years of rocks going down into the mantle of the earth, coming up as carbon dioxide from volcanoes, et cetera. And then, across the top, you can see a very fast and a slow cycle comparison. Yeah. I want to juxtapose now this fast and slow cycle, these cycles a little bit more. There's the fast cycle, which is really operating on timeframes that we experience. And then the slow cycle, which on the right-hand side of this diagram, part of that slow cycle, the fossil fuels being burned, going up into the atmosphere, you notice there's no arrow coming down, because on the timeframes that we experience, it's really a one-way arrow. And in effect, what we're doing when we're burning fossil fuels is we're taking those fossil fuels and adding all of that additional combusted CO2 into an already functioning fast cycle, right? So there's an awful lot more of carbon dioxide that needs to be accommodated, or maybe not, isn't accommodated in the current cycling. One more point of information before I get to the next slide, and that is that carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere. Its residence time is hundreds to thousands of years. So once carbon dioxide goes up into the atmosphere, for all intents and purposes, from our life, from the way we experience, is it's up there, and it's accumulating. So as we're putting all of this additional fossil carbon into the atmosphere, we can see concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increase. And this is, of course, what scientists measure and what they tell us, 350 parts per million. Right now it's at 411 parts per million. Pre-industrial was less than 300 parts per million. So we're continuing to accumulate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now that said, not all of that carbon dioxide stays up in the atmosphere. And I've got, there's a bunch of arrows here. Let me just point out the red arrow going from the terrestrial and going from the ocean up into the atmosphere. That's sort of the steady state. As the atmosphere is getting loaded with additional carbon dioxide, you see that the amount of carbon dioxide coming back into those active pools is greater than what's exchanging up with the atmosphere. I like this. I'm going to move us to another slide where it's a little bit more complicated, but I wanted to get a more simple vision for you, visual for you before I go to the next slide, which I think is, well, again, it's a slide for you to sort of take home and think about, but I'm going to walk you through a bunch of things on this slide. And you can see my cursor moving, yeah? Excellent. Okay. So let's unpack the slide with respect to some of the points that I've already raised. There are some active pools here, and the active pool, well, the atmosphere, it's a bit gray and white, and the land and the ocean. If we look over here on the right-hand side, I'm just going to point out that the figures on this graphic are in gigatons of carbon, not gigatons of carbon dioxide. And there is a conversion factor, and I'm not going to go into that, but the numbers are different than on the last slide. And I think we can just talk about this in terms of the numbers that are here. So we burn fossil fuels, and there's about 9.5 gigatons a year of carbon dioxide going up into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels. There is also 1.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide going up into the atmosphere because of land use change, deforestation, turning grasslands into croplands, all of that. And that adds up to 11. But 11 gigatons of carbon isn't what's added to the atmosphere. It's only about 4.9 because there's land uptake and there's ocean uptake. And if that all doesn't add up to 11, it's because there's a bit of uncertainty, and the uncertainty is just down here in the right-hand corner. But you can see that the atmosphere is absorbing a bunch more of that extra carbon. And already the land is absorbing a lot of that extra carbon, and the ocean is as well. We also know that absorbing that excess carbon is not without impact. I mean, in the atmosphere, we know absorbing the excess carbon leads to global warming. That's increasing the warming capacity of the atmosphere and increasing global temperature rise. In the ocean, it's ocean acidification, right? Because as carbon dioxide gets absorbed by the oceans, it lowers the pH of the ocean with significant impact there. And then land's, less obvious impacts of increasing the uptake of carbon dioxide, carbon in the land. But we also know that land is a source, and that as we restore ecosystems, as we change our agricultural practices, there's a lot more potential for land uptake, but that's a lot of work still that needs to be done there. But I think it's also important to note that there's already quite a lot of degradation and a lot of CO2 related to land degradation that's already in the atmosphere. So as we restore ecosystems, we're sort of putting that active cycle back in balance. So restoring ecosystems, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden we're going to be able to grab, I mean, we don't differentiate molecules in the atmosphere, but it's not as if the land can begin to compensate for all of the additional fossil fuel carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because there's actually a lot of past practice and getting the land cycle back into balance that comes along with increasing the uptake capacity of our land ecosystems. A few more points to note. Pulling down carbon from the atmosphere into the land or ocean sink is a temporary fix. And I want you to think again about the time scale. That if you want to get rid of fossil carbon dioxide, you don't want to stuff it into the active cycle. You really have to pull it back down into, we have to think in the order of hundreds, thousands of years that we need to sequester that carbon to make a difference. So stopping climate change really means stopping fossil emissions. It doesn't mean, you can't stop climate change with temporary sinks of carbon. So it's not so correct. And I think it's quite a bit dangerous to talk about the sequestration happening in the land sector as solving climate change. And it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, but I often see that we're going to solve climate change by restoring ecosystems. I absolutely think we need to restore ecosystems. And I absolutely think that ecosystems have a really important role to play in reducing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. But there's nothing that's going to get this cycle back into balance that's just associated with land, right? You have to stop all of that gray stuff going up. And so, you know, these diagrams like this, and I'm taking this from a project drawdown report that I think came out yesterday, which shows sources and sinks without any of that context, without any of the context of where are the sources from fossil sources or the sources from land use, are the sinks. Sinks are seen as just able to directly compensate for fossil emissions. And I think that's really quite a problematic picture, which I'm trying to help maybe complicate in your mind a little bit. Is the bit of the point of the talk. So I want to say a little bit about offsets now. The last part of my talk is going to be about offsets, net zero, negative emissions, some of the current context of carbon markets, where the science matters in the carbon market. So the idea of carbon offsetting is that one entity continues to emit carbon dioxide while another entity does something that supposedly offsets or compensates for those emissions. And I'm gonna, bracket and apologize to Ronald right now. I need to have a conversation with someone in French to think about how these terms might be. I'm gonna try and provide some nuance in English, but in French, I think it may be more difficult. Compensation, dédommager. Anyway, hopefully you can follow along with my attempt to distinguish offsetting from compensating. So in this slide, there's compensation. A wind turbine is constructed in order to offset the increase in carbon dioxide. We call this avoided emissions. There are avoided emissions offsetting in fertilizer, for fertilizer application as well. Perhaps you'll talk about that next month with the fertilizer university. So you avoid emitting something while you emit somewhere else. But is that really compensation? I mean, you still have CO2 in the atmosphere. And if you follow along from my original explanation, it's the CO2 in the atmosphere that matters because it accumulates. And it's very nice that we have wind power, but it doesn't actually stop the fact that there's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is accumulating. So I would say it's not compensation. But then the question is as well, what if we increase carbon dioxide emissions from the car on the left and we have some trees on the right, right? The carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere from the fossil stock. Trees get planted. There's a lot of caveats around that tree planting, right? Is it reforestation? Is it afforestation, where you're cutting down existing trees in order to put plantations, et cetera? I'm just going to bracket all of that. But after some amount of time, trees die. Maybe sooner, maybe later. There may be a forest fire, there may be bark beetles and drought, but the fossil CO2 is still up in the atmosphere. And I think we can use the same example for carbon sequestered in soils. If the fossil carbon emissions are still in the atmosphere and the carbon is sequestered in soils, but then a couple of years from now it's not, you actually haven't fully compensated for. Perhaps you have bought and sold an offset credit on the market. I think that offsetting is the wrong question. It's the wrong answer. And yet it is what everyone is talking about. And one of the reasons why everyone's talking about it is the Paris Agreement. So the IPCC has concluded that as concentrations increase, temperature increases more or less linearly. So if we know that we want to stay below a certain temperature, we can calculate how much more carbon dioxide we can put into the atmosphere because it accumulates up there. And we know more or less how much we want to accumulate before we want to shut things down completely because we want to stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees. And if it's cumulative and at some point we want to stay below 2 degrees, we can calculate, and you have probably seen these calculations of we've got 10 years left or we've got 20 years left. And I don't like to be that sort of rigorous in terms of that timing, but that's sort of how those numbers come about, is that if we're emitting 40 gigatons a year of carbon dioxide and the budget to stay below 1.5 degrees is another 400 gigatons, you can more or less calculate that we've got 10 years to sort of get to zero, to really get to zero. Staying below 1.5 or 2 requires us getting to zero at some point very soon, zero fossil emissions. But in the Paris Agreement, there was a conclusion that, well, it's really hard for countries to talk about zero. So they come up with this idea of net zero. By the middle of the 21st century, by 2050, emissions and removals have to be equivalent. And that's the idea of net zero. But net zero, this idea of net, hides a lot of things. You could have 10 minus 10 and get to zero. You could have 1,000 minus 1,000 and get to zero. And unless you know how much you're reducing your emissions, you don't actually have a sense of how much you're going to need to remove in order to be at net zero. There's quite a bit of, there's a few other things to say about this. If you only get to net zero by the middle of the century, that's still a lot of accumulation that's happening. And so this idea of net zero, well, I mean, it's problematic, and we can talk a little bit more about about how it's problematic in the Q&A. I recognize I've just got a few minutes left, so I'm going to try to get there to the end of my talk. This net zero is helping create a demand for offsets, because you can, you can look at this and you can think about the right-hand side, the number on the right-hand side of the equation as an offset. You shouldn't actually think of it as an offset. That really has to be a real removal. But there's a confounding between this idea of offset and removal, as in negative emissions that are brought down out of the atmosphere. And one way that people are talking about that mathematics, that question of offsets versus negative emissions, is to really call attention to that equation, right? To call attention to what's the first term in the equation, what's the second term in the equation, how much are we emitting and how much are we removing? And so making the argument that we actually need to calculate those separately. We have to account for them separately. We have to have a separate emission target and a target for negative emissions, because otherwise there's a confounding and an obscuring, right, of who's actually taking action to address climate change, and who's just trying to sell offsets for the sake of selling offsets. So, I'm going to go to my last slide because I'm at time. So I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to leave that for the Q&A. And hopefully my final words pull some of this together. So it does make sense to improve the health of soils, and that always brings along carbon, and that is always a good thing. Carbon in soils is volatile. It's part of the fast carbon cycle. And for that reason, it can't be seen as interchangeable or fungible with fossil carbon. So it makes zero sense to market soil carbon as if it were interchangeable. And I think this is dangerous, as it makes people conclude that soil carbon sequestration can be a solution to climate change. The only real solution to climate change is to stop putting fossil carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We do have to care for our sinks, and we have to increase our sinks, but this will actually mostly just be in compensation for the carbon that was lost from the terrestrial pool when we first deforested and tilled soils. Offsets are dangerous because they lead us to think that we can keep emitting fossil fuels and everything will be fine. And we must get beyond net thinking. We need both emission reduction and carbon removal. They can't be seen as carbon removal while we still continue to emit, which is the basic of offsetting, is that you emit and you remove. No, we need to not emit and remove at the same time. So thank you very much. And I look forward to questions and conversation.
Thank you very much, Doreen. Thanks for that wonderful presentation, that clear speaking style. I think Ronald, our interpreter, really appreciated that. Thanks for your talk, and thanks for staying very close to the time. Thank you. Tamara Gilbertson, I'll turn it over to you now if you want to share your screen, and you're on deck.
Great, thanks everyone. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks, Doreen. I hope that my talk will complement and continue this. Please interrupt me if I go too fast. I will do my best to, I sometimes just get very excited. So, great. So today I'm going to complement Doreen's talk with a little bit more on the politics of carbon trading. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. I'm going to start with a bit of a historical background just to kind of help us understand and situate where carbon trading has come from. I'm going to talk a little bit about what has come out of this process over the last almost 3 decades. I'm going to talk a little bit about false solutions that have come from these international agreements. I'll talk a little bit about the shift into focusing on carbon pricing and where that came from, what Article 6 in the Paris Accord is, or Paris Agreement, sorry, and some of the current trends that really follow closely upon what Dr. Stabinsky was speaking about earlier. So, as was very clearly articulated and explained by Doreen, is that there are different pools of carbon. So when we have fossil fuels safely locked under the earth, this is an inactive carbon cycle, but when it's brought out, it starts to interfere with the fast or the active carbon cycle, but also not just carbon, also other pollutants. And the earth is not able to absorb that in such a short period of time, or we wouldn't have climate change to begin with, right? Okay. We can trace this back to Rio de Janeiro in 1992, when the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development decided to meet to speak about the problems that they were seeing. This was mostly related to development programs or economic development programs that were impacting the global South or countries in development or in developing countries. And there was this need or thought for a need to move towards what they called sustainable development for the 21st century. So more sustainable mining or sustainable fossil fuel extraction or sustainable projects. In order to do this, then the UN met and created these 2 bodies out of what was Agenda 21 or the declaration, the Earth Summit Declaration. And these 2 bodies are the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, and the other body that was created from the Earth Summit was the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD. Okay, so these were the recognized bodies. We must address climate change and we must address biodiversity loss within the framework of economic development. And what came out of that later was the Kyoto Protocol that was signed in 1997. And initially, the Kyoto Protocol was agreed upon to reduce emissions by 5.2% based on 1990 levels. And it would just be a ratcheting down of extraction and pollution. But the United States at the time, led by the Vice President Al Gore, was very much pushing emissions trading, what they called flexible mechanisms at the time. It was a program that had been run in California in the 1980s, and the US pushed this forward. And by doing this, flexible mechanisms were then adopted into the Kyoto Protocol. And by the early 2000s, they were identified in 2 different forms. One was cap and trade, and the other is carbon offsets. So looking at this theoretically, you can see on the left-hand side, let's say A is a Chevron oil refinery and B is a cement factory. The idea of cap and trade is that this sits underneath a government compliant, it's run by a government entity, and that the government entity gives out permits for pollution, and the different installations, or here we have a oil refinery and a cement factory, can trade the permits or the permits that are given out by the government. They represent real money, and they can be banked. And of course, this is on a market. So like all markets, there's volatility. The price of those permits or the value of them can go up and down based on how many permits are in that cycle. But all cap and trade programs come with offsets. There's not a single cap and trade program in the world that does not include offsets. Offsets, as Dr. Stabinsky has explained earlier, are this idea of avoided emissions or sequestration or land-based sequestration and forest offsets and a multitude of other types, from large-scale dams to avoided emissions to fuel switching programs, and on and on and on. There are many methodologies depending on the cap and trade program. And this idea is the offset sort of burst the bubble. The polluting corporations can buy credits. Now, these are not permits, right? These are different. This is a different market, but they can buy the credits into it and then pollute above the cap. So ultimately, this program doesn't reduce emissions. It necessarily, it can actually increase, and we've seen that happen. So by 2005, the European Union emissions trading system, Japan's system, New Zealand has a system, and several other systems came online. Australia's been in and out and having different cap and trade systems. Later, the California and Quebec systems came online and several others. But at this point, these were the biggest ones. And they also came along with the offset program, which is the big one run by the United Nations. It's called the Clean Development Mechanism, or the CDM. There's another one called Joint Implementation, which was mostly set up for the former Soviet bloc countries. And then separately from that, there's the voluntary markets, which I will talk about a little bit later. The cap and trade system, just as an example, in the European Union is the biggest one in the world. It has over 12,000 installations in 30 countries. And what we see from studying this over the last 2 decades is that it has been a massive failure. By 2012, as predicted, the amount of permits and allowances in the system created an over-allocation, so that there was so much over-allocation, they weren't worth anything, right? This is a financialized market, just like any other stock exchange, for example. So if you have a lot of it in there, the value goes down. And what we saw was by 2013, the market value crashed so that a ton of carbon was really only worth about 2.5 euros. So like any capitalist system, the state then has to come in and fix the market. And the European Union created a backloading system where they just eliminated and pulled out the permits and said, okay, all of the CO2 doesn't exist anymore, to then raise the price of the permits, which again, this is fictitious commodity. They're obviously not really trading tons of CO2, right? This is, sort of like best, it ends up being a fictitious commodity. So today the price is slightly higher because of the backloading system, but again, there are talks in the future of creating more similar systems. For the Clean Development Mechanism, as the biggest offset program in the world, this is only in developing countries. There are over 7,000 registered projects, and this really followed quite similarly as the EU ETS. There were so many permits, there are so many carbon credits in the system because of so many projects that, again, they just weren't worth very much. And by about 2011, 12, they were the credits or the credits were worth almost nothing. Okay, so and then the programs have expanded to include a whole different range of sectoral markets. And many other types of markets since then. One of the things in the Kyoto Protocol that they did get right, I would say, is something called common but differentiated responsibilities. And that meant that countries in the global north, or developed countries like Canada and the US, the European Union, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, did have to reduce emissions. But countries in the global south, or developing countries, we're not, because they're not historically responsible for climate change, we're not required to reduce emissions. But what happened in this was that around about 2009, the United Nations met in Copenhagen to re-up the Kyoto Protocol that was due to end in 2012. And there was no agreement that they could get to. Ultimately, Kyoto was extended from 2012 to 2020, which is due to end this month, actually, where the Paris Agreement would take over. And I'll get to that in a minute. In Durban, the US and a few other countries really pushed to get rid of common but differentiated responsibility, saying that Brazil, South Africa, China, India were polluting so much it wasn't fair that they shouldn't have to reduce. So by Lima in 2014, all they could basically come up with was to call for these intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs, whereby each country would come with a plan to reduce emissions by a certain amount, by a certain time, and then they would add those all up in the Paris Agreement and say, this is what we can do. So the Paris Agreement ultimately was a bunch of INDCs from different countries around the world saying what they could do to reduce emissions. And thinking about this from a social justice and climate justice perspective, this is incredibly unfair for countries like Tuvalu, which is an island nation that which is quickly, impacted, which is very much impacted by sea level rise and an entire culture and people that are slated to be, taken off their lands. And about 95% of their energy is renewable energy from solar and from small solar projects. So if you want a good read, I highly suggest reading the Bolivia's INDC, which says something close to like capitalism is death, and it's a super interesting read, by the way. Today we have about 57 carbon pricing initiatives around the world. Now, when I say carbon pricing, I say this because after the markets crashed around 2013, the World Bank and a bunch of the leaders in the world came together to say, what are we going to do? We need a different language. People are saying carbon trading isn't working. How do we incorporate all of the systems in terms of jurisdictional systems, sectoral systems, subnational systems, carbon taxes, RED, big offset programs, all into one thing, and what are we going to call it? And so they kind of came up and repackaged it as this massive global program called, that is now called carbon pricing. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later too. But today we have 57 carbon pricing initiatives, 46 national, 28 subnational. There are new carbon tax programs in Singapore, South Africa, Canada, I'll talk about in a minute, Colombia, Mexico, Netherlands, and all over the world. And these are, these initiatives are multi-linked, okay? And this is just a quick map of some of the different systems around the world. So we can see that carbon pricing systems this is a very big thing. This is not just a sort of small new thing. We can trace this back over 2 decades, and it's proliferating rapidly. So what's happened in the last couple of years? And then I'm going to talk specifically about the Canadian systems and a few things to look out for and trends. In 2018, after the Paris Agreement was signed, they met in Poland and created a 300-page guideline. But there were 2 unresolved issues up to last year. And one was Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, and the other is a common time frame. So Article 6 is basically the architecture of carbon pricing systems and how trading will happen on a global scale. The 6.2 is what's called cooperative approaches. This is where climate change mitigation activities are implemented and can be transferred. Emissions reductions in one country can then be transferred into another country to be counted towards a nationally determined contribution. And these are traded through what are called ITMOs, or internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, as offsets basically between between countries to comply to their NDCs. So an example would be a situation where a national or regional instrument such as the European Union emissions trading system is linked to comparable systems to create a common cross-border carbon market. And this is national bilateral carbon credit trading systems operating outside of the UNFCCC. So Canada can then link their system to the US or to California Cap and Trade or to the EU, and there can be cross-border trading. And ITMOs, as far as we know, we don't really know yet what they're going to be, but reductions could be things from biofuel programs, forest offsets, we're not really sure. There's a lot of questions around double counting, leakage, additionality, and a bunch of other carbon trading lingo we can talk about later. The other part of this is 6.4, which is basically changing the clean development mechanism. Remember that big offsets program into what they're calling the sustainable development mechanism. This is not bilateral, but would be overseen by the United Nations, but also counting the offsets count towards the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions. So this also involves the private sector, so the major polluters, and they say they will be doing this by offering suitable incentives, including tax breaks and different mechanisms. There's non-market-based approaches as well. This is basically like conservation. This can be swapping wetland credits and wetland programs where they develop a region and the wetland is destroyed. So they do, they pay into a conservation banking system to supposedly, conserve a wetland in somewhere else. And there's so many examples of these dodgy conservation funds and other false solutions. And that's where we're at. So with the Paris Agreement was supposed, they were supposed to meet, the UN was supposed to meet last month in Scotland. That didn't happen because of COVID. That meeting is postponed to next year. In Scotland, people are organizing now for Scotland because Article 6 will then be sort of the rubber stamp put onto that. And what that looks like, it looks like a global carbon pricing system. So the latest trends are focusing on carbon pricing because it includes different types of carbon taxes, cap and trade, offsets, and RED, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, into sort of one big package. Carbon taxes are linked globally into carbon trading systems already in places like Colombia, where, for example, the mining, like Glencore, one of the biggest miners in the world, gets a carbon tax break for putting money into a RED program or a forest offset program on the other side of the country, which is on Afro-Colombian land and is a social justice issue. But we're seeing that, a lot of the language of promoting RED being shifted away and rather embedding RED into various carbon tax and voluntary schemes and some green fund schemes as well. We see a massive proliferation of the voluntary markets. So these are the ones that are not regulated by governments. These are the ones outside that any Joe Schmo can set up a company and say, hey, I'm gonna set up a carbon offset company. And they sort of, sell carbon offsets so you can go to a concert, a green concert that's offset by, they sort of give some of that money then to different communities that say that they're offsetting. The voluntary market massively, massively targets Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples are often exploited in this system in very real ways. And I can talk about that as well a lot more. The other sort of triangle that we're seeing is under what Doreen talked about around net zero emissions. And two of those plans are on the left-hand side under nature, what they're calling nature-based solutions, or like land-based offsets using forests and soils as so-called sequestration measures. But as Doreen rightly points out, the two are not equivalent. You can't just put fossil fuel in the atmosphere like that at such a high rate and expect the earth to be this limitless sponge. And the other side is a lot of talk about, capturing carbon, or carbon capture and storage, sometimes called carbon capture and sequestration, sometimes called carbon capture, utilization, and storage for manufacturing, also around direct air capture, and BECCS is bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and then also just to say that this has been done for a long time as enhanced oil recovery in the oil industry. So the oil industry will pull in CO2 to then inject it into the ground in fracking sites or underground oil facilities, but to use it to extract more oil. Okay, so when they say that the oil industry is, using carbon capture and storage, they're often using this to extract more oil and to pollute more. So it's, we see this as a false solution. Obviously, in the United States, there's a tax called the Q45 that oil companies get as a tax write-off for using it. And there's a huge push right now, including lots of federal dollars for research and development to push for CCS, or carbon capture and storage, which is not a solution to climate change. We see it as a false solution to climate change because a lot of the idea of direct air capture or using it in cement manufacturing, for example, this is unproven technology as it stands. Last year, for the first time, the voluntary markets superseded the compliance markets or the government mandated markets for the first time ever. Partially, this was due to a lot of the airlines, Delta, EasyJet, British Airways, but also due to Microsoft, Amazon, and all of the big corporations saying they're going to go net zero by 2030 or 2050. And to do that, in part, they are looking towards, electric vehicle fleets and reducing emissions in different ways in their processes, but a large part of that is about buying offsets and buying, especially from forest offsets and soil offsets, which is why we're here talking about this. One example is I want to talk a little bit here about Royal Dutch Shell. They've been in the game since day one. They have their own internal carbon trading market unit. So every time they sell or buy a permit or a credit, as a broker, they're making money off of it, right? So think about this in terms of financialization. They use all of the false solutions and have pushed this with the World Bank since the beginning. They say that they will now be net zero by 2050. And most recently, they've gotten into the nature-based solutions game. So one example of this is they acquired Australia's Select Carbon, which is a carbon farming specialist. And the Select Carbon then runs about 70 projects covering 9 million hectares of land. And Royal Dutch Shell has invested about $300 million into nature-based solutions project through their nature-based solutions unit. To run for the next couple of years. And by doing this, the example of the Australian, of acquiring Select Carbon means that they can then sell these credits on these farmlands that they say that they're sequestering soil carbon into the Australian carbon credit unit this is a voluntary emissions reduction fund market. And they sell those saying that they've reduced emissions on this other side. They can also do this by selling green tariffs to electricity customers. And both sides of that, they make quite a lot of money off of this. So Shell Oil basically gets to say that they're using nature-based solution, it makes them net zero, but on the other side, they're selling these credits and also using these in green tariffs and making money out of it. And we have a lot of questions around land grabbing with nature-based solutions because it's such a huge commodity right now, and also around, what lands are they buying and will they actually drill on them later? So we have a lot of questions on NBS. A couple more minutes on Canada, if I may. So Canada is a major player in the United Nations scene. It's part of the Green Climate Fund. Last year, it put $300 million into the Green Climate Fund. It's funding pilot projects for Article 6. There's 47 pilot projects as of about 2 months ago. I think it's still around that amount, but this is funded, these pilot projects are funded by Canada, Germany, Japan, Sweden, Switzerland, and then some development banks and the World Bank. And this is basically to jumpstart, you know, the trading and the global trading for Article 6 when it's signed into next year. BECCS is a major issue for Canada as well. Remember, this is bioenergy for carbon capture and storage, because about 85% of wood pellets in Canada are exported, mostly to Europe. And you can read about this on the Canadian government website of looking at using BECCS as an offset itself. And then also Corsia, which is the aviation sector, and the headquarters, of course, is in Quebec, is in Montreal, I believe. So this is just sort of the international scene. And then a little bit here about, you know, the sort of state of the federal government legislation. And you all probably know this better than I do. But in 2016, the pan-Canadian pricing on carbon pollution was pushed. And this was the idea that each territory or province has to either have a carbon tax or a cap and trade system that would, you know, sort of harmonize with the Paris agreement of 30% emissions below 2005 levels by 2030. In 2018, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act was pushed. And this is basically a trading system based on output-based pricing system. And then all of the different provinces have their own sort of things. So British Columbia has a Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act, plus a carbon tax, plus a forest carbon protocol for carbon offsets. Quebec is linked to the California cap and trade system. So California and Quebec run their system together simultaneously, and they're fungible across borders. And then you probably also know very well that Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan filed a lawsuit against the government. And this is currently under appeal in the Supreme Court, saying that imposing the 2018 Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act is unlawful. Just last month, Canada passed the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, where Canada says it wants to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And this, they say, part of this will be underneath will be regulated by the financial minister. And they say that they're going to launch new funds to attract investments in companies making zero emissions products, as well as cutting the corporate tax rate in half for those companies. So basically, polluting industries that say they're reaching their net zero emissions by using offsets will get a tax cut. I'm gonna time check. Well, how am I doing? Should I stop here? I've got tons more to say, but I can stop here.
I think unfortunately we should maybe stop you just to give some time for the Q&A, Tamra.
Sure. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. That was really excellent and very, very clear. Okay, so thanks to our speakers.